In this last module, we considered the lessons from that mobile money story and how it applies to health and mHealth in terms of actor networks and the role of the private sector. With actor networks, there's an emerging field of social network analysis. How do we actually analyse who is talking to who? It's not enough just to tweet randomly into the ether in order to get the business deal going. Really, you actually need to make a systematic process for getting the right people in the right room so that they can talk to each other. You can't guarantee that they would come up with the new proposition and that that proposition will be accurate and take off. But in a sense, you need to create the space for people to network and talk. I mentioned in the story the whole element of creating a new conference where specific actors came together. What I didn't say was that that whole process started with an analysis of conferences and spaces. So there was actually a systematic social network analysis of who attended. So actually getting participant lists from conferences and seeing who attended banking conferences, who attended telecom conferences. Of course, with a good idea, you often can't understand why you didn't see it before you had that idea. Once you've seen it, it seems to be a no-brainer to say that bankers went to banking conferences and telecoms went to telecom conferences. But until that actor network analysis was undertaken, nobody thought that. And in fact, when we analysed something like 50 to 60 different conferences, we found only 3 people who had actually been across those different sectors. And that enabled us to find the 3 people we should go and talk to. And because they had contacts in both the banking sector and in the telecom sector, they proved a useful networking person. So we used the actor network analysis not just to identify the institutions, which should be in the conversation, but even right down to the individuals. Is there any equivalent for health? Well, yes, because there are various health conferences, there are various health spaces, there are various dialogues on internet discussion points. There are key journals in health. Evidence is considered very important. And there are key players, key institutions that have very good record for what they say and are therefore very influential. If they can get behind a mHealth proposition, then it's likely to go forward. If they become over-enthusiastic about an mHealth proposition, then it could go forward even though it's not quite right for the people. If they feel the mHealth proposition is not correct, they can also slow it down in the same way the banks tried to slow down the mobile money. The second point I want to raise is the role of the private sector in going to scale. Replication is not straightforward. A lot of people look at MPesa in Kenya and ask the question, why didn't it bounce into Tanzania and take off with the same growth? Vodafone started MPesa in Tanzania relatively soon after operating in Kenya, and yet it experienced all sorts of difficulties that meant its uptake was not quite the same. It didn't have that same growth curve. It is happening now, and in fact all 3 operators in Tanzania have mobile money, and they're each seeking to gain a greater share of the market through those propositions. There are all sorts of things that affect the business private sector rollout of something like mobile money. Take, for example, liquidity. There's a wonderful story of MPesa in Afghanistan. In fact, Afghanistan was the second place that Vodafone launched MPesa, but there it found that liquidity was a problem. In a kiosk in Kenya, if you go in and you want to cash out some of your money, and the kiosk owner just happens not to have the cash, he will say to the customer, "Oh, can you come back in a couple of hours and I'll get the cash for you?" And nobody worries about that. They go away and they come back in a couple of hours, having done some other things. In Afghanistan, when people ask the kiosk operator for cash and he says that he doesn't have any, then they draw out their guns and threaten them, saying, "It's my money, why can't I have it now?" So liquidity, which is the bane of all banks, trying to keep the cash points filled, trying to keep the banks with enough cash to hand out to customers, was being sidestepped in an organic way in M-Pesa Kenya, and yet that organic way didn't work in Afghanistan. So there are various business models that need to be created, and they often depend on the context. So although Tanzania and Afghanistan have migrant workers trying to send money home, and therefore seem to have the same situation as Kenya, in fact it was subtly different, and there were those subtleties that had to change the business model. There's also the challenge of who is the mobile network operator. In another African country, we will leave them unnamed, somebody actually tried to instigate mobile services, value-added services, and the chief executive officer was not that keen. So for a couple of years, it just went nowhere. The chief executive officer of the mobile network operator changed, the next person was enthusiastic about the value-added services, and now it's beginning to take off. All these things are just the realities and practicalities of running business models within the private sector. You have to get the price point right. You have to make a profit. Again, I've already said that without the slight subsidy of public funds, it's possible that M-Pesa would never have been launched. And even when M-Pesa was launched, it didn't make a profit for the first couple of years. It's only now they are reaping the full benefits of it. So what's the equivalent of health? And particularly mHealth? You can't just approach the private sector and say, we want you to send nice health messages to people. There has to be a value proposition in it for them. They have to see that it's either going to what they call reduce churn. So that means that people who have signed up for their network stay with their network because of this extra value of the health service. Or people have to pay for it in some way. Many of us are not used to paying for health information. We see that often as a public good that should arrive to us through the health system. So there are challenges in taking an mHealth proposition to scale from the private sector point of view. Is it profitable? Does it add value? Does it enhance my business model?